Welcome, one and all. This is a presentation on nutrition and hydration for endurance events. I teach nutrition in Berkeley, and I started this presentation last year to support the Gonzo and updated a little bit this year. And I thought to do this because I've noticed some people seem to get more fatigued than I thought they otherwise might on longer paddles. And I've hypothesized that that's because of a depletion of carbohydrates or dehydration, both of which can really fatigue you. So why don't we jump in? I've already offered my background. Some of these slides are really small, so I apologize for that. I have spread them out a little bit more. So let's talk some fundamentals. It's important never to get behind in your food and drink. Once you're behind, playing catch up can be extremely difficult, especially with fluids, which we will talk about a little bit later on. There's a really special process called bonking once your tissues are completely devoid of glycogen, which is our storage form of carbohydrates that we store in our muscles and in the liver. And once we bonk, then it's really hard to catch up. The best practice is to try and drink and eat in small amounts. Allowing the digestive system to process things and give us the carbohydrates that we need in a little bit at a time. It's good to vary the foods and the drinks that we take in. A mixture of solid food, but also liquids, which could come in the form of gels or gummies or actual carbohydrate liquids. And as far as fluids, much of the fluid should be water, but some of that can also be in a carbohydrate form. And then some additional electrolytes that are sodium heavy are also quite important. By the way, if you have any questions, feel free to ask questions as we're going along. You don't need to save them for the end. So let's take a look at what event day nutrition might look like. It's best to eat about 150 calories every 30 minutes. This is when we're talking about a long distance event. Events that are less than an hour and a half or 2 hours, you really don't need to supplement much, if any at all, for that. But when we're talking about a long distance event, an event like the Gonzo, where you're paddling all day, it's best to supplement about 150 calories every half hour. My preference is what's called a Bobo bar, which is what I feel to be nicely palatable oat bar. Good old trail mix. The Middle Eastern delicacy called halva, which is a press of sesame and honey. Also really good options. Gel packs or gummies are a little bit more dense in carbohydrates, and I typically save those for later in the day. I allow for more complex things to be digesting earlier in the day, and then later in the day, when things really start to wane a little bit, I get carbohydrates into the bloodstream even quicker with gel packs or gummies. Best to try and separate your snacks into these 150 calorie increments before you launch, the night before, as opposed to trying to separate things out while you're on the water. At stops are a good time to sort of sort out your snacks. Some of your snacks you might have in your PFD or in your skirt quickly at hand every half an hour. And then when you stop, you can go into your hatch or a deck bag and move things around. The stops that I like to space out are at Angel Island, Treasure Island, and Red Rock. I've found that to be a nice spacing if you're going to do a full gonzo. I use at least 2 forms of liquid. Really, last time I went with 3, water, an electrolyte replacement, and a carbohydrate beverage. I can only drink so much water at a time and so much electrolyte, and having a carbohydrate beverage that I enjoy gets me to drink more. I aim for 3 quarts during a gonzo, 3 quarts to a gallon. I find that during the event itself, I'm probably only drinking about 3 quarts, and I drink that last quart after landing. Let's talk about how much to eat. I mentioned earlier, if it's less than 2 hours, you don't need to eat. We have enough calories in our tissues in the form of glycogen to support us for that amount of time. But once we get beyond 2 hours, that's when we need about 150 calories every half hour. For moderate paddling, which is really the type of paddling that we do during the gonzo, a 175-pound person burns about 417 calories an hour. Some of those calories you will get from your own body, from the glycogen stored in the muscles. Some of those calories you can get from your fat stores, but the rest, approximately, I don't know, 200 to 300 calories, depending on your body size, needs to come from food. And the information about how many calories we burn when paddling comes from a site called Fitness Volt. So what exactly are good sources of energy? In the nutrition world, we have 3 kinds of macronutrients: proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. That's what makes up most of the components of the foods that we eat. All 3 of those, proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, can be used as energy sources. Proteins don't make the best energy source. They're more complex to break down. They have to be broken down in the liver, so they take a little longer. And the byproducts of protein digestion is a little bit dirty. Among the byproducts is ammonia. So protein, not the best source. Protein, very important to help repair muscle tissue after an event, but during an event, not the best source. I prefer fats and carbohydrates over proteins for energy. Carbohydrates are going to be our quickest source of energy and really the preferred source for our muscle tissue. So I lean heavy on carbohydrates. But in the beginning of a long distance event, I also like a little bit of fat because that will burn a little bit more slowly over time, helping later in the event. With high intensity exercise, we burn more carbohydrates and glycogen. With low intensity, we burn more fat. At 50% max aerobic capacity, 50% of calories comes from fat. So with an event like the gonzo, we're more in the 75% realm. Well, it depends on the individual, but 50 to 75%. It's not quite high intensity exercise like a race would be. A race would be much higher intensity. but long distance events are typically more moderate intensity. So some from fat, but mostly from carbohydrates. So how many calories we have in our tissues is dependent, calories in glycogen, is dependent on what type of diet we have. If someone is on a moderate carbohydrate diet, a diet where 40 to 50% of the calories we eat in a day comes from carbohydrates, then that person stores about 1,000 calories in their muscles and in their liver in the form of glycogen. For someone on a high carbohydrate diet, 60 to 70%, that person stores about 2,000 calories in their tissues. The idea of carbohydrate loading comes from this concept, because you want to have as many calories stored as glycogen in your muscle tissue as you can on the day of an event. We'll talk more about carbohydrate loading momentarily. We can actually calculate what kind of calorie deficit we have when we're paddling, when we look at the calories burned from the calories that we might get from fat and from glycogen. So as an example, a 175-pound person paddling moderately for 11 hours burns about 4,500 calories. That person has a moderate carbohydrate diet, they get 1,000 calories from glycogen. They might burn another 1,500 calories from fat, but then they need another 2,000 calories from food and drink during the gonzo.
Hey, David.
Yeah.
Got a quick question for you.
Yes,
my Apple Watch tracks my calories. I'm just wondering how accurate that is.
Ooh. I think that.
So like today, I
burned
burned 649 calories, supposedly.
You burned 649 calories on a 2-hour paddle or an hour and a half?
That's just for the whole day that I went on a 3-mile walk, but mostly I've been sitting in front of my computer.
That's super low. That's not accurate at all. Because you're probably burning 2,000 to, based on your body size, even a little bit more, 2,000 to 2,400 calories in a day.
Okay. Thanks.
Just living, I think we burn 150. It's either 100 or 150 calories at rest. Just living, respiration, blood moving, the brain going. That's 100 to 150 calories an hour. Yeah. All right. Let's talk a little bit about carbohydrate loading. So on the last slide, I kind of gave it away. We need carbohydrate load in order to make sure we're maximizing the amount of glycogen in our muscles, because that glycogen is going to help to fuel us throughout the event in a very efficient way. Pulling glycogen from the muscles is very efficient. The higher our daily carbohydrate intake, the less carbohydrate loading is necessary. So if you have a carbohydrate-rich diet to begin with, this is not something I'm advocating. This is not something I'm advocating that we do at this moment. But for a long-distance professional athlete who's training long distance all the time and doing lots of events, living a pretty carbohydrate-heavy life is actually probably a balanced thing to do. For those of us who are not professional long distance event athletes, for us, it's much better to carbohydrate load before the event. Along with that, it's important not to do that much in terms of exercise right before the event. Um, and I've been actually, it's funny, as I was putting this slide in for the presentation tonight, couldn't help but think of a paddle that I was thinking of doing the day before the Gonzo that would just go out to Rat Rock and the Sisters so that myself and whoever else wanted to go would really have good bearings for Rat Rock and the Sisters in the dark the next morning. This would be a very mild paddle, but actually it might be better done a few days before rather than the day before. The less carbohydrates we have in the diet, the longer you should actually carbohydrate load. And earlier in the week, James, you asked me this very question. And so for someone who's on a very low carbohydrate diet, that's typically someone who's on what's called a ketogenic diet, which would be less than 35 grams of carbohydrates a day. That person probably should carbohydrate load for 6 days. The first 3 days upping their caloric intake to about 50% from carbohydrates, and then the last 3 days upping it all the way to 70%. And the idea here is about 4.5 to hit that 70% of calories, about 4.5 grams of carbohydrates per pound of body weight. I caution for anybody who is doing a very low carbohydrate diet for health reasons, such as diabetes, that carbohydrate loading is not for you. Someone on a low carbohydrate diet, less than 100 calories a day, might carbohydrate load for 3 days. And then someone on a moderate to high carbohydrate diet can load the day before. So there is some variation as to how long carbohydrate loading should take place, and that depends on what the typical diet is of the individual we're talking about. I have a little chart here about, it's a way to estimate how much glycogen might be in the muscles of the lower legs. This comes from the cycling world, so they're really concentrating on the lower legs. But it's important to note that muscles only use the glycogen that's in the muscles being used. So if you're not using your legs to paddle, then you won't get to take advantage of the glycogen in the legs. So forward stroke should always come from the legs. It's not only good. It's not only a good idea to do that because it's an efficient way to do a forward stroke. It also allows you to take advantage of the glycogen in the legs.
Wow.
Yep. I think I kind of talked about this already. At a high intensity, 95% of calories should come from carbohydrates, only 5% from fat. Moderate intensity, 75% from carbohydrates. This is what really, what we really need to think about for an endurance event like the Gonzo. Protein, not a good fuel source. Eat fat a little bit earlier. Also carbohydrates, but a little bit of fat earlier in the event. Probably closer to straight carbohydrates in the afternoon. Any questions on food and eating for the event? We're going to sort of shift into hydration at this point. Not that we can't go back to to eating, but I wanted to see if there are any questions on eating before we move to hydration.
Not a question, but a comment. I took your example of the 175-pound person, which is kind of me.
Yeah.
If I do the Gonzo in 11 hours and I have a 2,000 calorie deficit, I need to have like 120 calories 13 times or something. Basically, I can't miss a food stop, you know. It's a lot of eating to
It
get to
is.
1,000 calories.
It is that, and that's part of why it's important to do a little frequently. That's why that 150 calories every half an hour is that way. Because you don't want to try and cram down 300 calories an hour. And really it's a little less than that. You don't want to have to cram down all those calories because your digestive system can't process that much all at once. And you're going to feel heavy, you're going to feel sluggish. Eventually your stomach's going to say, what the fuck? And things are just going to slow down. So really important to do a little bit in a relatively constant fashion. I like to paddle with a spray skirt that has pockets in it. That keeps snacks real close at hand. And of course the PFD. All right, we move on to hydration. So we're going to talk about a perfect world. In a perfect world, important to begin really well hydrated. Urine should be light in color, fingertips should be plump, not pruny at all. Drinking extra water during the week, probably 64 ounces or more per day will help us to be nice and sufficiently hydrated on the day of the event. Here's where things get a little bit difficult for a kayaker, trying to begin the day with about 16 ounces of water 2 to 3 hours before exercise. Well, if we launch at 5:30 a.m., trying to get those 16 ounces in at 3:30 is a bit of a challenge. Additionally, another 8 ounces about 10 to 20 minutes before exercise. This is something that I personally don't do because I'm trying not to stop for a couple of hours into the paddle. When we're paddling, we lose a bit more through sweat than we do through urine, which is, well, through sweat and urine, we lose about 16 to 24 ounces every hour. When we're sweating a lot, which we typically don't do that much on the Gonzo, on the average Gonzo, because it's typically not that warm. But if it does happen to be an unseasonably warm day, then we probably need a little bit more and a little bit more electrolyte. For us, you're going to find that this slide looks a whole lot like in a perfect world. Begin well hydrated, drink extra water the week before. Here's where we might edit things a little bit. That 16 ounces of water, we might do closer to launch than 2 to 3 hours if we're launching at 5:30 in the morning. That 8 ounces, 10 to 20 minutes before launch is something that I don't usually do. Same 16 to 24 ounces as with another event. My goal is 128 ounces. I usually finish the end of that after I land.
David, how sensitive is this to your body temperature? So if I wear, say, a paddle jacket, not a dry suit, and I have multiple layers and I can adjust my temperature and keep myself not too hot, is that going to have a big impact on the hydration I need?
It'll have some impact. There are two factors that won't change at all. The first is respiration. We actually lose a lot through respiration. That's not listed here. So that's not going to change at all. The other thing that's not going to change is urination. Your kidneys are going to process water at the same rate. As far as perspiration is concerned, sure, there might be some difference there if you do a better job of venting. But I don't know if it is significant enough for the average person, someone who considers themselves a big sweater. That person might benefit significantly. But for the average person, I don't think it would matter enough to go down below, let's say, 3 quarts. Yeah. Drink before you're thirsty. Once we start to feel thirsty, the body is already under some stress, and we're trying to ask our body to do something that really it doesn't want to do. We're putting a fair bit of stress on the body, especially towards the end of the event. And so adding another stressor with dehydration, which is, we are in the beginnings of dehydration when we start to feel thirsty, is another stressor that we're adding on top. Beyond that issue, when that happens, when we take in less fluid, the stomach empties more slowly. So it's important to take in fluid in small amounts frequently rather than trying to take in large amounts all at once. Especially if we waited too long, we start to get thirsty, we start to get a little dehydrated. The stomach starts to close up a little bit. Food doesn't move through as well, which means we're not getting calories in as efficiently. And it's more difficult to get water in once that stomach starts to close up a little bit. So it's important to hydrate relatively steadily to keep the stomach from closing up. This is actually a pretty important concept in why it's important to steadily hydrate. So if this is not completely clear, please do speak up. Electrolyte replacement. You know, before I was researching for this presentation last year, I had always been under the assumption that coconut water would be an excellent electrolyte replacement. Coconut water has a really nice array of minerals. But the one thing that is problematic with coconut water for us is that it has more potassium than sodium. And we lose, as paddlers, we lose more sodium than we lose potassium. So we need electrolyte replacements that are heavier in sodium and lighter in potassium. So coconut water, not the best option. Adding carbohydrate beverages into the mix is a really good option. Carbohydrates in beverage form are the quickest, most digestible forms of carbohydrates. So we get the carbohydrates into the body much more quickly. The other nice thing about a carbohydrate beverage, as long as it's a beverage that you enjoy, not something that's designed for performance that's really salty and not very palatable, but when it's something we really enjoy, then it's something you're going to drink more of, making it a lot easier to stay hydrated. Carbohydrate beverages increase the rate of intestinal water and sodium absorption as well. I think there must be some sort of synergy between the electrolytes and the carbohydrates that allow for that to happen. A combination of different sugars can help to get more carbohydrates into the tissues, because we digest different carbohydrates differently and at different rates. One carbohydrate I don't have here is maltodextrin. Apparently maltodextrin is one of the easiest forms of carbohydrates to digest. One of the tricky things about carbohydrates is that in order to process glucose, you need quite a bit of water. And maltodextrin apparently does not need a whole lot of water. So maltodextrin, while typically when I see maltodextrin on a label, I think to myself, oh, that is a really processed sugar. I'm going to go look for something else. For an event where you're trying to replace carbohydrates, maltodextrin becomes your friend. Fructose, well, we should have some fructose. Fructose can reduce gastric emptying also, which can increase gastrointestinal distress. So when choosing carbohydrate replacements, some fructose is fine, but not a whole lot of it. All right, post-exercise, we need to replace, we usually need to replace quite a bit more fluids for events like the Gonzo in order to fully rehydrate. Some of that depends on how hot it is out. Kind of getting to your point earlier, Jonathan, the hotter it is out, the more we need to replace after an event. Probably not such an issue on the Gonzo. After the event, replacing carbohydrates is going to be helpful for how you're going to feel for the days after the event, because you need to replace the glycogen back into the muscles that you've used. So some carbohydrate replacement important after the event, but also some protein also very important after the event, because during the event we break down muscle tissue. Protein very important to help rebuild muscle tissue. There's a substance called creatine. We don't need it for the Gonzo. I thought I would put it in here for people who might be doing events in much warmer climates. Creatine helps to increase heat tolerance during exercise. So it can be really helpful to get the body hyperhydrated. So more important for really intense exercise in hot and humid environments. I included a chart for the carbohydrate and electrolyte composition of different sports drinks. It also includes osmolality, which is a factor of how easy it is or difficult it is to get water into tissues. And there's some interesting things here. Really, I think the sports drinks in general are going to do a more balanced job than the other beverages down at the bottom.
David, quick question for you. Can you talk a bit about
Yes.
Nuun? N-U-U-N. It's a
Nuun.
A sport drink.
So Nuun, Nuun, N-U-U-N, and LMNT are Nuun is slightly older. LMNT is quite a bit newer. They are electrolyte replacement powders. I don't think either of these companies are actually making a liquid form, but they're powders that we put in water that we can use as electrolyte replacement. And those are my favorite brands because of the carbohydrates that they put in. LMNT actually has much less carbohydrate. Nuun has a moderate amount, but they both are pretty low in fructose. In fact, LMNT doesn't have fructose. I'm not positive about Nuun.
And Nuun comes with both a caffeinated and a non-caffeinated. What's your perspective on caffeination?
Yeah, right. So caffeination, caffeination depends on the individual. Someone who's very caffeine sensitive, caffeinated beverages just not appropriate. For an event, at different times in the event, caffeination can be helpful to give you an extra little boost. I think that there is also a little bit of misunderstanding about coffee, tea, and caffeine as they relate to hydration. The first is that it isn't the caffeine in coffee and tea that may or may not dehydrate us. It's chemicals in the tannins that do that. The second is that there are some people who say that when you drink coffee, you need to hydrate more. And the reality is that coffee doesn't dehydrate you more than the amount of fluid that it replaces. And so I don't consider an 8-ounce cup of coffee as taking in 8 ounces of fluids, but I also don't believe that when you have an 8-ounce cup of coffee, that instead of drinking a pint of water, you now need to drink 24 ounces of water. And tea is even kinder, especially green tea, from a dehydration standpoint. There are many people in Asia who don't drink much water at all and drink a lot of tea. And so the concept of dehydration as far as tea and coffee go, I think is quite overblown. And I think coffee for some people might be appropriate. I'm sorry, did I say coffee? Caffeine for some people might be appropriate. Does that answer your question, James?
It sure does. Thank you.
Cool, you're welcome. All right, on to breathing. This is a new topic for this year. We get up to 80% of our energy comes from our breath. And it is probably the least regarded activity that we do all day because it's just so automatic. And the reality is, there are things that we can do that really can help to improve our performance if we think about the breath just a little bit. The first thing that's important is that most people in our society breathe really shallowly. And when that happens, air is not fully exchanged through all of the lobes of the lungs. The best way to take a nice deep breath is not to concentrate on the inhale, but to concentrate on the exhale. Trying to expand one's lungs using the muscles of the chest is an incredibly difficult thing to do. But contracting the abdominal muscles and diaphragm, pushing out all of the air from our lungs, is actually a relatively easy thing to do. And once we do that through vacuum pressure, the lungs naturally fill to their complete extent. This process allows us to expel all of the carbon dioxide from the lungs and take in as much oxygen as we possibly can. Something that can be really, really helpful. There was a time where I found that I would have lactic acid pain in the muscles in my rotator cuff while I was paddling. Marianne Ferda pointed out something which I'd forgotten, and that is that lactic acid is produced when we have too much carbon dioxide in the system. The minute that I started concentrating on my breath and exhaling out all of the carbon dioxide, automatically, the first day I tried it, no more lactic acid pain. So trying to breathe as deeply as possible, especially concentrating on the exhale, can be very helpful. Inhaling through the nose also has some pretty significant benefits. The most important of which is when we inhale through the nose, we produce a biochemical called nitric oxide. Not nitrous oxide or sweet air, but nitric oxide. Nitric oxide has a couple of really important benefits for the cardiovascular system. It decreases blood pressure through vasodilation. So our blood vessels dilate, they become bigger. That decreases the blood pressure and it increases oxygen saturation. So it helps to get even more oxygen into the muscles. The lungs become humidified a little bit more, and that helps with carbon dioxide and oxygen exchange. And less important for our event, but kind of important in life, the cilia in the nose help to filter out pollutants and allergens. So breathing in through the nose as much as possible is pretty important whenever that can be done. All right. So taking a rest as much as when you can on the event can be really helpful. But when taking breaks, trying to keep those breaks as short as possible so that the muscles don't tighten up and the motivation doesn't wane is kind of important. I think it's important to try and keep breaks to 5 to 15 minutes and trying not to make them much more than 15 minutes. This is for a long distance event, not for your average paddle. Things that are important to get done during a rest break: stretching, doing some movement, taking a bio break, taking in some extra food and drink, making snacks and liquids more accessible, moving things around from our hatches to the PFD or our spray skirt, reapplying sunscreen. Any boat maintenance? Hopefully no boat maintenance needs to happen at a rest stop. Let's look at the summary. Drink before you're thirsty. A variety of things, some water, some carbohydrate-rich beverage, some electrolyte-rich beverage. Eat before you're hungry. Don't try and eat in larger amounts. Eat a variety. In the early times, carbohydrates and fats, and then later on, more in the afternoon, combination of solids and liquids that are primarily carbohydrate. Other things to think about: sunscreen, lip balm with sunscreen, rash cream for chafing, athletic tape. One of the important things about training paddles is you get to learn what things might chafe, what things need to be taped, what things might need moleskin. For those of us launching in the morning, having lights on our boat, red and green running lights. Headlamp, not necessarily the best option because it attracts bugs right to your face. I like to use something called a swoosh. Some people use what's called Jackson Sweet Cheeks on a really long distance paddle. The butt can get kind of sore. I already talked about packaging snacks in smaller amounts so that they're easy to get at. For those who don't already do this, having a water bladder in order to drink efficiently is really important with an event like the Gonzo, because if you don't have a water bladder, you have to put your paddle down relatively significantly for more significant amounts of time to get at your water. I think a water bladder is pretty crucial. A small first aid kit might be important, remembering that this event is an independent event. Repair kit, hopefully something you will not need. Doing mobilizations to loosen up the hips, the shoulders, the lower back, wrists, forearms, any problem areas that you might have. Taking your feet off of the foot pegs every now and then if the water's calm and your knees or your hips are starting to get tired can, even if it's just for the shortest amount of time, can help take stresses off of those joints. And I've included some references that I used for the presentation. Any questions?
Thanks, Dave. That was really great. Could you share just some of your choices for nutrition? You know, what things you eat and drink?
Yeah. I use as an electrolyte powder LMNT. I think it is I think so far it's the brand that I have found to be, I hate the term, but I'm just going to say the most natural. And I think it probably allows for more bioavailability of the nutrients in the beverage. On the Gonzo, I will probably drink 1.5 to 2 quarts of water, 1 quart of electrolyte beverage, and then maybe a pint to a quart of an Arnold Palmer, which is a tea and lemonade mixture. That is one of my favorite carbohydrate drinks. I enjoy it, so it helps me to drink more. As far as food goes, I am mixing it up this year a little bit more. I like Bobo bars, which I've mentioned. I eat halva earlier because of the sesame in the halva. Gives me a little bit more fat. I saved some really good dense fruitcake from the holidays in the freezer. And I saved a big block of panforte, which is kind of similar to an Italian fruitcake. That's also in the freezer waiting for the gonzo. So I'm just going to cut those up into cubes. Yeah.
Wow, a use for fruitcake. There you go.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I have a question about the water bladder.
You bet, Evelyn.
I have one for backpacking, and I just realized that, wow, even though it fit behind my kayak seat, I couldn't access it because I had a spray skirt on. So what sort of water bladder do you use?
Okay, so the water bladder I use is the Kokatat water bladder that attaches to my PFD. Other people have just used camelbacks that they rig up to their PFD. You know, Camelback, and of course there's so many brands now, come sometimes with really thin, flimsy backpacks. That's just a bag for the Camelback that runners might use, let's say. And then those bags can then be rigged up to a PFD. So that's something that some people have done. But Kokatat, the Kokatat bladder is, the one thing I'm not fond of the Kokatat bladder is that it's 1.5 quarts instead of 2 quarts. I wish it were 2 quarts. But I also have another 2-quart bladder that I put in my PFD. I also use a Neptune PFD, which has its own bladder sleeve, the Kokatat Neptune. And so I actually can put a second bladder in that sleeve, and then the Kokatat bladder in the Kokatat pocket. I actually wind up using 2 bladders for the gonzo.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. More questions?
Not a question, but a comment on the bladder. I've found that the kids Camelback backpack is the perfect size to fit on your PFD. And like you said, it's 1.5 liters, I think, but it's still the perfect size for a PFD. And it's cheaper than the adult one.
Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the things with the Kokatat. The Kokatat bladder pocket and bladder is like $90, I think.
Oh, so when you say you rig it onto your PFD, do you, and assuming that Camelback thing is in like a little backpack sleeve, do you sew the backpack sleeve onto your PFD, or do you just wear it?
James, is this something that you do?
Yeah, it's something that I do. Let me show you what I have. If I can show you my, gonna turn my video on.
David, maybe stop sharing the screen for a moment.
You bet.
Yeah. So here we go. So this is my PFD. That's the Camelback. You can see it says Camelback, and it's just the backpack straps, you know, tied on, and then it just comes right,
it's just threaded.
it just goes right in there.
Oh, okay. Okay,
So
great.
yeah, just put your backpack onto your Camelback or onto your PFD instead of onto your back.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Good to see all you lovely people. May we get to paddle again together soon.
This was very informative.
Thanks.
And
Thanks, David.
You bet.